Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and today I'm back with another Ludicrous Logistics. This time I was thinking about how much everyone, including myself, loves to talk about how good lands are, and which lands are the best lands. But there's so little out there about which lands are bad. I asked myself, which land is the absolute worst land? And I didn't know the answer. Me, the guy obsessed with land, didn't even know. And if I don't even know, how's the average player supposed to know? So today, we're going on a quest to find the worst land. I'm sure everyone has something that comes to mind when asked what the worst land is, but which one is definitively the worst? It's Urza Saga. Urza Saga is the worst land. It makes no sense being a land. It has no business being a land. Why is it a land? Wizards, point it out on the map. Where is it? Where is Urza Saga? Oh, it's nowhere? Yeah, because it shouldn't be a land. Ranting aside, this does raise a further question. What actually defines something as being definitively the worst? Because there's different things to be good or bad at. Urza Saga is a very good card mechanically, but flavor-wise is ridiculous, because sagas aren't places. So Urza Saga is, at least in my opinion, the worst flavored land. But most everyone is probably more concerned about card mechanics over flavor, so let's look for some lands that have terrible mechanics. A great starting point is lands that are format specific. Command Tower is great in Commander, but is utterly useless outside of it. It literally just becomes a vanilla land in any other format, except Oathbreaker, because that's pretty much the same. But any other format that has no commander makes Command Tower do nothing except exist as a land. So it can still trigger landfall, it can still count towards creatures like Beanstalk Giant and Lumra, or spells like Dreadwaters and Earth Tremor that all count number of lands, and it's still a valid target for land destruction from cards like Beseiju and Reap and Sow, or bouncing effects like Guildlands. But so is literally every other land. Other examples of lands that become vanilla outside of their intended formats are Command Beacon, Path of Ancestry, and Paliano the High City. These are good cards that are just bad if used outside of their intended purposes. So this is pretty surface level bad, and it can definitely get worse. Just like one step further in would be something that used to be useful but has become outdated. Like, there are some very old lands in Legends that give banding between legendaries, and this is an old, outdated mechanic that hasn't been printed in many years, making these pretty obscure and not very useful, especially since they don't even make mana. But these aren't actually what I was referring to, because they can still be played to this day in Commander or just older formats, and they still give banding. They're not very good anymore, but they do still do what they're meant to do. Unlike Teleria from the same set, which removes banding, and while it still could technically do that, it's almost entirely useless because there's so few instances of people using banding that it almost never has a valid target. Using a niche old mechanic that's almost never seen is one thing, but targeted counter for a niche old mechanic that's almost never seen is basically worthless. Maze of Shadows is another card in this similar vein that is a targeted counter for a mechanic that's almost never seen. Although in this case, the ability it targets Shadow does still occasionally get used, just incredibly rarely to the point that there's no reason to add Maze of Shadows to a deck without prior knowledge that you're matching up against a deck that runs Shadow. These are pretty decent at their specific task, but that task is just too specific to get value. Taking another step deeper, we have some cards that aren't necessarily bad, but are basically the worst in their category. Because if everything else does what you do, but better, you're kind of the worst. And I'm of course referring to cards like Pure Tap lands. These are easily outclassed by every other dual color that gets a way to come in untapped, or has some other attribute to make up for being played tapped. Even bad untap effects like the Unluckies are objectively better than none at all. Other than maybe a drafting set where they're the literal only option for dual colors, there's no real reason to choose them over any other dual color, and actually there's some that are even worse. The flip dual colors in Modern Horizons 3 not only are pure tap lands having to compete with every other better dual color, but they also have spells on the front of their cards, making them compete with their own cards themselves, making them even less desirable to play than regular pure tap lands. But even those are still better than the nap lands, which only get to be used every other turn for no real benefit. But the worst of the worst dual colors are the original Ice Age depletion lands, which are effectively nap lands, except that they have counters put on them, which means they're susceptible to your opponent proliferating more counters on them to completely shut them down. But these aren't the only category, so these aren't the only things that are the worst at what they do, because, there's lots of other things. Like, sorry to say, because I love wastes, but waste is the worst basic. It doesn't have its own subtype, and it makes colorless mana, which is just weaker than colored mana. And wastes isn't bad, but it's definitely the worst basic. And then you have stuff like Rainbow Veil, which is probably the worst any colored land. Every land that makes any colored mana has some sort of balance or cost to make it more fair, but giving it away to an opponent every time it's used is just ridiculous. At best, it gives your opponent an extra mana every turn, and at worst, they just never tap it and you never get it back, leaving you a land behind. Although there is another multicolored land that is also the worst, but in a slightly different category. The worst Pain Land. Pain lands, like the new Starting Town, Mana Confluence, and City of Brass, are known for their fair trade-off of 1 life for a mana of a chosen color, but Tarnished Citadel does the same thing at the cost of 3 life. This isn't necessarily awful, because it is still a decently powerful effect, but why would you ever choose to run a Tarnished Citadel over a Mana Confluence unless, I guess, you're specifically trying to drop your life? And then you have stuff like filter lands. The worst filter lands are the original tricolor filter lands from Homelands. Color fixing usually means that you sacrifice your opportunity to make more mana in order to get more desired colors, tapping and exchanging a mana for effectively using 2 to get 1 of a specific color, or sometimes even trading 1 mana and that tap for 2 of specific colors to break even. But these homelands don't do either for 2 of their 3 colors, costing 2 mana and tapping to make 1. Yikes, they're bad at their job. But on the other side of this coin, they do still color fix, which can still be useful. They're the worst at it, but it's still not necessarily bad. So we can definitely keep getting worse. Because now we're getting down to stuff like Rhystic Cave, the only land with a counterable mana ability, and is a pretty easy counter at that. 1 mana to stop it is barely anything. Most of the time, your opponent isn't even going to tap the max amount of lands or mana producing artifacts or whatever that they have every turn, which means that they'll usually have the counter available even without specifically saving one to counter it, and its probability only goes up in multiplayer formats like Commander. Trying to use it on your opponent's turn to play counterspells after they've already tapped the last of their mana is the safest way to tap it, but it removes a lot of the choice involved in what to counter, because you kind of just have to respond to their last card. Your opponent could always just choose to not counter it, but it's more likely that your Rhystic Cave will get countered every time you try to use it if anyone has mana available. But at least it more or less amounts to a net neutral when countered and an actual benefit when not countered, because they do still have to spend some resources on it, which is more than I can say about the Modern Horizons 3 flip lands. I already brought up some MH3 flip lands, with the dual colors from earlier being pure tap lands, but the monocolored flip lands are an active detriment to play, either costing life or coming in tapped, just for essentially a basic that's not a basic. With the possible exception that you want to drop your own life, this is literally just worse than a basic. It has no types to affect anything that cares about that. It costs life just to be at the same speed as a basic, with no extra abilities to make up for it. Not to mention that just like the other flip lands from the set, they're competing with themselves. Choosing to play a worse basic over the spells on the front is certainly a choice, and it's almost never the right one. But it can still get worse because there's even more punishing detriments from land. Here we take Tomb of Arami. This land deals self-damage when it taps for mana unless you control an ogre, which isn't, I guess, too bad in a ogre deck, but also isn't great. But its second ability costs effectively 5 mana and sacrifices literally all of your lands, including itself, to put a 5/5 flying creature token in play, which by no means is a weak creature, but you could alternatively just cast a 5 mana flying creature like Bloodthirsty Conqueror, which not only is better because it has more abilities, but it also doesn't sacrifice all your lands. However, while that cost is too steep for what you get, you at least get something useful, which is still more than I can say about Sorrow's Path. Sorrow's Path taps to swap two defending creatures with each other, which is not the best effect. It could potentially let you kill things you wouldn't have killed otherwise because your opponent chose to block a certain way, but this can't even get around stuff like flying and reach and whatnot because it can't make illegal blocks. You still have to follow normal blocking rules. So this is very, very circumstantial at best, and it does so at the cost of 2 damage to yourself and all of your creatures. Actually, it's not only that, but it deals the damage every time it's tapped at all for any reason. Which means if your opponent has, say, a Rishadan Port, they can tap it on your turn before you even get to combat, so you take all of the damage and don't even get the opportunity to use its awful effect. Sorrow's Path is an active hazard to have on the field, to the point where the best way to use it is to give it to your opponent and force tap it yourself. If the best way to use a land is to not use it, it's pretty darn bad. I am very confident in saying that this is the worst land ever printed. And that ends the quest. We found multiple worse lands, each awful in their own ways, but if you think I missed anything, or have different ideas about what the worst land is, like the worst place to be in universe, or the most annoying one to play against, let me know in the comments. Then be sure to drop a like for turn and subscribe for more land-filled content, and I'll see you in the next one.